After my husband passed, my son told me something that didn't make sense, and I smiled like I believed him. The house still smelled like the casseroles neighbors had dropped off after the funeral, and the sympathy cards were stacked neatly on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker Robert had used every morning for 32 years. I was standing at the sink, rinsing the same mug twice without realizing it, when Daniel walked in without knocking. He had his key, of course he did, but something about the way he stepped inside, quick and purposeful, made me turn before he said a word. "Mom," he said, loosening his tie like he'd just come from a meeting instead of his own father's burial 3 days ago. "We need to talk about the house." I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel, folding it the way I always had, keeping my movement steady. "The house isn't going anywhere, Daniel. I just buried your father." He gave a small, tight smile, the kind he used when closing a deal. "That's actually what I mean. There are things you don't know. About Dad. About how everything's set up." Behind him, Melissa stepped in quietly, setting her oversized tote bag on the chair by the door like she planned to stay a while. She didn't look at me right away. Instead, her eyes moved across the room, taking in the hardwood floors, the staircase, the framed family photos on the wall. I had seen that look before in real estate brochures. Evaluation, not memory. "What kind of things?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Daniel reached into a slim leather folder and pulled out a stack of papers, crisp and official-looking. He placed them on the kitchen island, right where Robert used to sort the mail every afternoon. "Dad created a trust," he said, "a long time ago. The house, the accounts, they're part of it." I stared at the papers, but didn't touch them. "Robert and I didn't keep secrets like that." Melissa finally spoke, her tone soft but measured. "It's not really a secret, Evelyn. It's just paperwork most people don't think about." I let that sit for a moment, then stepped forward and placed my hand flat on the counter, right beside the documents. I could feel the cool granite under my palm, grounding me. "Then explain it to me," I said. Daniel glanced at Melissa before continuing. "The trust lists me as the managing beneficiary. It means I handle decisions about the property. Maintenance, taxes, potential sale if needed." The word sale hung in the air longer than anything else he'd said. I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though nothing about this was funny. "You're talking about selling my home 3 days after your father's funeral." "I'm talking about making smart decisions," he replied, his voice firmer now. "This place is too big for you. The upkeep alone, your father built this life with me." I cut in, not raising my voice, just holding it steady. "Every mortgage payment, every repair, every holiday dinner in that dining room. Don't reduce it to square footage." For a second, something flickered across his face. Impatience, maybe even guilt, but it disappeared just as quickly. Melissa reached into her bag and pulled out a glossy brochure, sliding it across the counter toward me. A retirement community. Clean sidewalks, smiling gray-haired couples, a clubhouse with rocking chairs on the porch. "It's actually a beautiful place," she said. "Just 20 minutes from here. Low maintenance, lots of activities." I didn't pick it up. Instead, I looked at Daniel. "When were you planning to tell me about this trust?" He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "Dad didn't think it was necessary to go into details," he said. "He trusted me to handle things when the time came." I nodded slowly, letting his words settle. Then I reached out and finally touched the top sheet of paper. The ink was sharp, the signature at the bottom unmistakably Robert's. But something about it felt off. Not the name, not the handwriting, the timing. "Funny," I said quietly, tracing the date with my finger. "Because your father and I were sitting right here at this counter 2 years ago, going over our will together. And he never mentioned a trust." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but I lifted my hand slightly, stopping him. I smiled then, calm, polite, the way I had learned to smile through decades of PDA meetings and family disagreements. "If this is how things are set up," I said, "then I suppose I'll need to understand every detail." Melissa relaxed a little, thinking, perhaps, that I was agreeing. Daniel nodded, relieved. But as I looked down at that document again, at the date, stamped neatly in the corner, a quiet question settled into my chest, heavy and persistent. Because if Robert had truly signed this years ago, why did the filing date read 6 months after he died? I did not sleep much that night. The house had a different kind of quiet, the kind that pressed in on you instead of settling around you. Around 6 in the morning, I walked into the kitchen and found the coffee maker already running. For a brief second, my heart lifted because Robert always woke before me, always started the coffee. Then I saw Daniel standing there, scrolling through his phone with one hand and holding my favorite mug in the other. "You're up early," I said, keeping my tone light as I stepped closer. He glanced up, surprised, then gave a quick nod. "Yeah, I figured I would get a head start on some things." He set the mug down on the counter, but not in front of me. He kept it near him, like he had claimed it without thinking. "Some things?" I asked. "Just organizing," he said. "Bills, accounts, making sure nothing slips through the cracks." I reached past him and pulled another mug from the cabinet, pouring my own coffee. The smell was familiar, comforting, but something about the moment was not. On the counter beside his elbow sat a small stack of unopened mail. I recognized the envelopes immediately. Utility bills, a statement from the bank, and one from Medicare. They had been delivered yesterday afternoon. I had placed them neatly by the fruit bowl. Now they were opened, the edges torn cleanly. I picked up the bank envelope, sliding the paper out carefully. "I was going to go through these today," I said. Daniel took a sip of coffee before answering. "I figure I would save you the trouble." My fingers tightened slightly on the paper, but I kept my voice steady. "That is kind of you, but I have been handling my own accounts for a long time." Melissa's voice came from the doorway. "We know, Evelyn, and you have done a great job. This is just temporary, until everything settles." She walked in with her hair neatly pulled back, already dressed as if she had somewhere important to be. She reached for one of the opened envelopes and glanced at it briefly before placing it back down. "There are a lot of moving parts right now. Insurance, property taxes, your Social Security adjustments. It can get overwhelming." I folded the bank statement and set it down, then looked directly at her. "Overwhelming for whom?" There was a brief pause. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, nobody is taking anything away from you. We are just trying to help." I nodded slowly, then turned my attention back to the statement. The numbers were clear. Monthly balance, deposits, withdrawals. But one line caught my eye immediately. A transfer, $1,200, labeled simply as maintenance. I frowned slightly, scanning the previous page. Another transfer. Same amount. Different date. My voice remained calm. "Daniel, what is this maintenance charge?" He leaned over, glancing at the line I was pointing to. "That is for the house," he said quickly. "General upkeep, repairs, landscaping, things like that." I looked up at him. "We have not had any repairs done. The lawn service is paid quarterly, and it is nowhere near that amount." Melissa stepped in smoothly, her tone measured. "Sometimes expenses get bundled together. It is easier that way for accounting." I held her gaze for a moment, then looked back down at the paper. 2 months, 2 identical transfers. No receipts attached. No notes. Just money moving out of my account. I set the statement down carefully and reached for the next envelope. Electric bill. Slightly higher than usual, but nothing unusual. Then the Medicare notice. I opened it and scanned the top paragraph. My coverage details were the same, but the mailing address listed at the top was not. It was not my home. It was Daniel's address across town. I read it again, slower this time, making sure I had not misunderstood. Then I placed the letter flat on the counter and tapped the address with my finger. "Why is my mail being redirected to your house?" I asked, looking up at him. Daniel hesitated just for a second. "It is not redirected. It is just listed as a secondary address." Without asking me, I said. Melissa stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "It is a precaution, Evelyn, in case something gets lost or delayed. We are making sure nothing falls through the cracks." I let out a quiet breath, then nodded once, as if that explanation satisfied me. "I see." I picked up my coffee and took a small sip, giving myself a moment to think. Across the counter, Daniel relaxed slightly, mistaking my silence for agreement. Melissa reached for her bag, already shifting toward the door. But as I stood there, holding that warm mug in my hands, a pattern began to form in my mind. The open mail, the unexplained transfers, the changed address. None of it had been mentioned before yesterday. None of it had required my permission. I set the mug down gently and looked at Daniel again. If you are managing things now, I said evenly, then I would like to see every account, every statement, starting today. He nodded a little too quickly. Of course. That is fair. I gave him a small, polite smile. Good. Melissa paused at the doorway, watching me more carefully now. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something behind her composure. Not guilt. Not quite. Calculation. And as I glanced back down at the Medicare letter at the address that was no longer mine, one question settled in deeper than the rest. If they were already receiving my mail, what else had they been receiving without me knowing? I did not wait for them to bring me anything. After Daniel and Melissa left that morning, I cleared the kitchen table, rinsed the dishes, and dried my hands slowly, the same way I had done every day for decades. Then I went upstairs to our bedroom and opened Robert's old filing cabinet. It sat in the corner near the window, a little worn at the edges, but still organized down to the last folder. Robert believed in records. Receipts, insurance policies, tax returns, everything labeled, everything dated. If there was ever a trust, it would be here. I pulled open the top drawer and flipped through the folders, my fingers steady even as my chest felt tight. Property deed, insurance, retirement accounts. Then I found the will, the one we had signed together 2 years ago, sitting at the kitchen counter with a notary who had driven out from town. I remembered that afternoon clearly. Robert had joked about how serious it all sounded, then squeezed my hand under the table and said, "This just makes things easier for you later, Evie. Everything stays simple." I sat down on the edge of the bed now and opened the document again. The language was straightforward. The house, the accounts, everything passed to me. No mention of a trust. No mention of Daniel managing anything. I turned the pages carefully, checking each line as if something might appear if I looked long enough. It did not. A quiet knock came to the front door, pulling me out of the moment. I closed the folder and set it aside, then walked downstairs. When I opened the door, Carol stood there holding a foil-covered dish. "I made too much lasagna," she said gently. "Thought you might not feel like cooking." "That is very kind of you," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. Carol had been my neighbor for over 15 years. She knew the rhythms of this house almost as well as I did. She set the dish on the counter and glanced around, her eyes lingering on the open mail, the scattered papers. "Your son's been by a lot lately," she said casually. I nodded. "He wants to help." Carol hesitated, then folded her hands together. "Evelyn, I do not mean to overstep, but I saw Melissa here on Tuesday afternoon. You were not home. I thought maybe you had asked her to pick something up." I felt something shift inside me, small but definite. "Tuesday?" I asked. "I was at the pharmacy and then the grocery store. I was gone maybe an hour." Carol nodded. She had a key. Let herself in like it was nothing. Stayed about 20 minutes. Carried a folder out with her when she left. The room felt very still. I walked over to the counter and rested my hand on the edge, grounding myself again. "Are you sure it was a folder?" I asked. "Yes," Carol said. "One of those thin ones, like you would use for legal papers. Light brown." I thanked her for the lasagna, and after she left, I stood there for a long moment, staring at the cabinet where I kept Robert's documents. Then I moved. I went back upstairs, opened the filing cabinet again, and this time I counted. One folder missing. Not obvious unless you knew exactly what belonged there. But I did. I pulled out the remaining files and checked each label carefully. The property deed was still there. The will was still there. But the folder labeled supplemental documents was gone. I sat back on my heels, letting that settle. Robert had created that folder himself years ago. It was where he kept anything that did not fit neatly into the standard categories. Notes, drafts, correspondence. If someone wanted to build something that looked official, something that could pass for legitimate, that would be the place to find the raw material. I closed the drawer slowly and stood up, my mind moving faster now, connecting pieces that had not made sense before. The filing date on the trust. The missing folder. Melissa in my house when I was not there. Downstairs, I could still smell the coffee from that morning, faint but present. I walked back into the kitchen and looked at the stack of open mail again, then at the Medicare letter with Daniel's address. For years, I had believed that trust in a family was something steady, something earned and kept. Now it felt more like something that could be rewritten quietly without asking. I reached for my purse, pulled out my phone, and scrolled to a number I had not called in a long time. Robert's attorney. My finger hovered over the screen for a second before I pressed call. The line rang once, twice, then connected. Harris and Cole Law Office, a voice answered. I took a breath, steady and measured. This is Evelyn Carter, I said. I need to review every document my husband ever filed. There was a pause on the other end, then a polite response. Of course, Mrs. Carter. We can schedule you this week. I ended the call and set the phone down gently. For the first time since Daniel had placed those papers on my counter, I did not feel like I was reacting. I felt like I was stepping into something with my eyes open. But as I looked toward the front door, imagining Melissa walking in with that key, carrying a folder that no longer sat in my cabinet, one question rose above all the others. If they had already taken documents from my home once, what else were they planning to take next? I chose the earliest appointment they had, which meant I was sitting in a leather chair across from Mr. Cole by 9:30 the next morning, the same man who had handled Robert's paperwork for years. His office smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the kind that had been sitting on a warmer too long, and the walls were lined with framed certificates that made everything feel official in a way my kitchen never could. He adjusted his glasses as he flipped through the documents I had brought, including the trust Daniel had shown me. You said your husband never discussed this with you? He asked. Not once, I replied. And we reviewed our will together 2 years ago. This was not part of it. He nodded slowly, then turned the page, studying the signature carefully. For a moment, he said nothing, and the silence stretched just enough to make me sit straighter in my chair. Finally, he set the papers down and folded his hands. Mrs. Carter, he said, his tone measured, this signature does appear to be your husband's. However, he paused, tapping the bottom corner of the page with his pen. This document was filed 6 months after his passing. I felt my breath steady rather than catch. I had already seen the date, already let that realization settle into something sharper. So it could not have been submitted by him, I said. Correct, Mr. Cole replied. At minimum, someone else handled the filing. And there is something else. He turned the document toward me and pointed to a section I had not fully understood before. This clause references an amendment. There should be an accompanying document detailing the transfer of authority. It is not here. I leaned forward slightly. Would that amendment be necessary for this to be valid? He gave a small, careful nod. Yes. Without it, this trust is incomplete. It would not hold up if challenged. The room felt different after that, not heavier, but clearer, as if a fog had lifted just enough for me to see the shape of what I was dealing with. Then someone created this, I said, choosing my words carefully, and filed it without the required documentation. Mr. Cole met my eyes. That would be my professional assessment. I sat back in my chair, letting that settle into place alongside everything else I had discovered. The missing folder, Melissa in my house, the redirected mail. This was no longer a question of misunderstanding or misplaced paperwork. This was deliberate. What would you recommend? I asked. He reached for a legal pad and began writing in neat, precise lines. First, we request certified copies of all filings associated with your husband's estate. Second, we secure your current assets, bank accounts, property titles, anything that could be affected. And third, he looked up again. We do not alert anyone yet. If there is misconduct, it is often better to let the other party believe their actions have gone unnoticed. I gave a small nod. I understand. When I stepped out of his office, the late morning sun felt warmer than I expected. I sat in my car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, replaying everything he had said. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder with the trust documents again. This time, I looked at them differently. Not as something confusing or overwhelming, but as something constructed, something that could be taken apart. I drove home slowly, pulling into the driveway just before noon. Daniel's car was already there. That in itself was new. He had not mentioned coming by. I stepped inside and heard voices from the dining room. Daniel and Melissa, speaking in low tones that stopped the moment the front door closed. I walked in calmly, setting my purse on the side table. I did not realize you were coming over today, I said. Daniel straightened, offering a quick smile. Just checking in, Mom. Making sure everything is okay. Melissa stood beside him, her posture relaxed but her eyes alert. We thought we would help you go through some more paperwork, she added. I glanced at the table. Spread out neatly were several documents I had not seen before. One of them caught my eye immediately. A printed property listing. My address at the top. Estimated value. Square footage. Suggested asking price. I walked closer, picking it up between my fingers. You have already contacted a realtor, I said, my voice even. Daniel shifted slightly. We are just exploring options, getting a sense of the market. I looked from the paper to his face, then to Melissa. Without asking me, Melissa stepped in smoothly. We are trying to stay ahead of things, Evelyn. It is easier to make decisions when you have information. I set the paper back down carefully, aligning it with the others as if that small act of order mattered. Then I looked at Daniel again, holding his gaze a second longer than before. I met with Mr. Cole this morning, I said. There was a brief pause. Not long, but enough. And Daniel asked, and he confirmed that your trust is missing a required amendment, I replied, which means as it stands, it is not valid. The room went very still. Melissa's expression did not change, but something behind it tightened. Daniel let out a short breath, then forced a small laugh. Well, that is just a technicality. It can be fixed. I tilted my head slightly. Yes, I said. I imagine it can. I let the silence sit for a moment, then added, the more interesting question is who filed it in the first place. Neither of them answered immediately, and as I stood there, watching the two of them calculate their next words, I realized something had shifted, not just in what I knew, but in how they saw me. I was no longer someone to manage quietly. I was someone asking the right questions. But as Daniel finally opened his mouth to respond, one thought moved to the front of my mind, sharper than the rest. If this document was only the first piece they had put into place, how many others were already in motion that I had not uncovered yet? Daniel did not argue right away. Instead, he reached for the property listing and slid it slightly to the side, as if clearing space for a different conversation. Mom, he said, his voice lower now, more controlled. This does not have to turn into something complicated. We are on the same side here. I watched him carefully, noting the shift. He was not dismissing me anymore. He was adjusting. Then start acting like it, I replied. Melissa stepped in before he could respond, her tone calm, but firmer than before. Evelyn, we are trying to protect you. That house is a liability at your age. Property taxes alone are over $6,000 a year now. Insurance keeps going up. If something breaks, you are the one responsible. She reached into her bag again and pulled out another sheet, placing it on the table in front of me. This one was different. A printed estimate from contractor. Roof inspection. Recommended replacement within 12 months. Estimated cost, $18,400. I stared at the number for a moment, then looked up at her. When did this inspection happen? I asked. Daniel answered this time. Last week, while you were out. The words landed cleanly. No hositashchen. No apology. Just a statement of fact. I felt the weight of it settle, not as shock, but as confirmation. So you let someone into my home without telling me, I said evenly, to assess repairs that I did not request. We were being proactive, Melissa said. This is exactly what I mean. Things are already slipping through the cracks. I let out a small breath and folded the paper once, then placed it neatly beside the property listing. Nothing is slipping, I said. You are moving faster than you should. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. Because time matters, he said. If the trust needs to be corrected, we need to act now. That means aligning the assets, making sure everything is positioned the right way. I held his gaze. Align for whom? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his folder and pulled out one more document, this one thicker with a blue tab at the top. He set it down carefully in front of me. This is a temporary management agreement, he said. It allows me to handle financial decisions on your behalf while everything gets sorted out, just until things stabilize. I did not touch it. You want me to sign something that gives you control, I said. It is not about control, he replied quickly. It is about efficiency. Bills, repairs, potential sale discussions. It is easier if one person is authorized. Melissa nodded beside him. It is standard, Evelyn. Families do this all the time. I glanced down at the document, scanning the first few lines. Legal language. Authority over accounts. Discretion over property decisions. Broad, clean, and very convenient. Then I looked back up at them. And if I do not sign it? I asked. Daniel's jaw shifted slightly, just enough to show the pressure underneath. Then things get slower, he said. More complicated. And honestly, more expensive. Legal fees add up quickly. There it was. Not a threat exactly, but close enough to feel like one. I nodded once, as if considering it seriously. Then I reached for the contractor estimate again and held it up slightly. $18,000 for a roof, I said. $6,000 a year in taxes. Insurance going up. You are building a picture. Melissa's voice softened. We are showing you reality. I set the paper down and folded my hands calmly in front of me. Said, you are presenting urgency. The room went quiet for a moment. Daniel exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, his tone shifting again, more direct now. Mom, I need you to understand something. If this is not handled properly, the house could become a burden you cannot carry. And if that happens, decisions will have to be made quickly. Without preparation, you might not have a choice. I studied his face as he said it. Not anger, not cruelty, just calculation wrapped in concern. That was what made it dangerous. I gave a small, polite nod, then slid the unsigned agreement back toward him. I will review it, I said. With my attorney. Melissa's eyes flickered just briefly. Daniel leaned back in his chair, masking his reaction with a tight smile. Of course, he said, that is reasonable. But as he gathered the papers and closed his folder, I noticed something else on the table. A small, folded receipt I had not seen before, partially tucked under the listing. I reached for it before he could. What is this? I asked. Daniel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. I unfolded it. A locksmith invoice. Dated yesterday. 2 new keys issued. 1 line circled in blue ink. Secondary access duplication. I looked up slowly, meeting his eyes. Why would you need new keys? I asked. When you already had one. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. And in that moment, I realized the pressure was not just about the house anymore. It was about access, control, and something they were preparing for that had not happened yet. Because people do not change locks unless they are planning to decide who gets to stay and who does not. I did not answer his question about the keys right away. Instead, I folded the receipt once, then again, and placed it neatly beside my coffee mug as if it were just another piece of paper that could wait its turn. I'm sure there is a reasonable explanation, I said calmly. Daniel gave a short nod, but he did not offer one. Melissa reached for her bag, her movements precise. We should get going, she said. We have already taken up enough of your time today. They gathered their things quickly after that, the conversation ending without resolution, but not without weight. I walked them to the door, watching as Daniel slipped the folder under his arm and Melissa adjusted her coat. I will call you later, he said, pausing just long enough to sound like a son again. We will figure this out. I smiled faintly. Yes, I replied. We will. When the door closed behind them, the house felt quiet again, but it was not the same quiet as before. This time it felt like space. Space to think. Space to move. I turned the lock slowly, listening to the soft click, then stood there for a moment longer than necessary, my hand still resting on the handle. Then I walked back into the kitchen, picked up the locksmith receipt, and read it again carefully. 2 new keys. Secondary access duplication. Dated yesterday afternoon. The same window of time Carol had mentioned. I set it down and reached for my phone. This time, I did not hesitate. I dialed the number printed at the top of the receipt. It rang twice before a man answered. Frank's Locksmith Service, he said. How can I help you? Hello, I said, keeping my voice even. I'm calling about a service completed yesterday at my address. There was a brief pause as he pulled up the record. Yes, ma'am. We replaced the front door lock and provided 2 additional keys. Everything seemed straightforward. I leaned slightly against the counter. Replaced, I repeated. Not just duplicated? No, ma'am, he said. Full replacement. Your son authorized it. Said the old lock was sticking. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, focusing on the edge of the countertop. And the keys? I asked. 2 issued. 1 for him, 1 for his wife, I believe. That is what they requested. Thank you, I said quietly, then ended the call. The house had not felt different when I walked in earlier. The door had opened the same way. The lock had turned the same way. But now I understood why. It was not my lock anymore. I walked to the front door and looked at it closely, running my fingers along the metal. It was new, clean, installed without a word to me. For a long moment, I stood there, taking it in. Then I turned, walked upstairs, and opened Robert's filing cabinet again. This time, I did not look for what was missing. I looked for what remained. There were copies. Duplicates Robert had made out of habit, stored in a separate envelope tucked behind the main files. I pulled them out carefully and spread them across the bed. Notes in his handwriting, early drafts, correspondence with Mr. Cole, and there, among them, something I had not paid attention to before. A letter, not addressed to me, not addressed to Daniel, just marked in case of review. I sat down slowly and unfolded it. The paper was slightly yellowed, but the writing was clear. Robert's voice, steady even on the page. He had outlined contingencies, safeguards, specific instructions about what should happen if any document appeared after his passing that had not been discussed or verified. My fingers tightened slightly on the edges of the letter as I read the final line. Trust must always be confirmed, not assumed. I let out a slow breath and folded the letter carefully, placing it back on the bed. Then I stood, walked to my closet, and reached for the small lockbox on the top shelf. I had not opened it in years. Inside were the originals of several documents, including the deed to the house and the notarized copy of our will. I set them on the dresser and looked at them for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone again and dialed Mr. Cole's office. I need to come back in, I said when he answered. And I need to bring everything. When I hung up, I did not feel rushed. I did not feel overwhelmed. I felt prepared. Downstairs, the new lock sat quietly on my front door, exactly where Daniel had arranged for it to be. But now I understood something he did not. A lock only controls who can come in if everyone agrees who owns the door. And as I looked at the documents laid out in front of me, one question began to take shape with sharper clarity than before. If Robert had already anticipated something like this, what else had he put in place that Daniel and Melissa had not found yet? Mr. Cole did not ask many questions when I returned that afternoon. He simply cleared a larger space on his desk and motioned for me to lay everything out. The originals from my lockbox, the copies from Robert's cabinet, the trust document Daniel had brought. For the first time, all of it sat in one place under proper light, with someone who knew exactly what to look for. Let's go piece by piece, he said, adjusting his glasses. I watched as he compared signatures, dates, formatting. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way Robert used to read contracts at the kitchen table, never skipping a line. After several minutes, he stopped and tapped the edge of one of the pages. Here, he said, this is where it breaks. I leaned forward. What do you mean? He turned the trust document toward me and pointed to a notary seal stamped in blue ink. This notary commission expired 8 months before the filing date, he explained. That means this document could not have been legally notarized when it was submitted. I stared at the seal, something I had barely noticed before. A small detail, easy to overlook. So, it is not just incomplete, I said. It is invalid. More than that, Mr. Cole replied. It suggests that whoever filed this either did not verify the credentials or assumed no one else would. The room felt sharper after that, as if every piece had shifted into clearer focus. There is another issue, he continued, reaching for Robert's letter. Your husband anticipated the possibility of unauthorized documents. This clause here, he slid a page from the will toward me, one I had not examined closely before, states that any asset transfer not explicitly disclosed to you during his lifetime defaults back to your sole ownership, regardless of external filings. I read the line twice, then once more, letting the meaning settle fully. So even if someone tried to move control, I said slowly, it does not override this. Correct, he said. In fact, it strengthens your position. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the past few days shifting into something steadier. Not relief. Not yet. But direction. What happens next? I asked. Mr. Cole folded his hands. We prepare a formal response. We do not confront them emotionally. We confront them with documentation. Quietly, precisely. He paused, then added, and we secure everything immediately. Accounts, property records, access points. Access points. The word landed differently now. The locks, I said. They replaced them yesterday. Mr. Cole's expression did not change, but his tone sharpened slightly. Then we addressed that today. By the time I left his office, I had a folder thicker than the one Daniel had carried into my kitchen. Certified copies. Legal notes. A drafted letter ready to be finalized. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. White siding. Blue shutters. The oak tree in the front yard Robert had planted when Daniel was 10. But as I stepped out of the car, I noticed something new. A small black box mounted near the front door, just above the handle. I walked closer, my steps slowing slightly. A keypad. Clean, recently installed. I reached out and touched it lightly, then pulled my hand back. Inside the house, I could hear movement. Voices. Daniel's, low and steady. Melissa's, sharper, more focused. I opened the door carefully and stepped inside. They were in the living room this time, not the dining room. Papers spread across the coffee table. My coffee table, the one Robert had refinished himself years ago. Daniel looked up first. Mom, he said, standing quickly. I held up a hand, stopping him. You installed a keypad, I said, my voice even. Melissa stepped forward slightly. It is more secure, she said. No more worrying about lost keys. I glanced at the device again, then back at her. And who has the code? I asked. There was a brief pause. Daniel answered. We do, and we were going to set one up for you. I let that sit for a moment, then stepped further into the room, placing my folder on the table beside their papers. That will not be necessary, I said. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? I opened the folder and slid the top document toward him. It means, I said calmly, that we are going to start following the correct process. He looked down at the paper, scanning the heading, the legal language, the firm's name at the top. Melissa leaned in beside him, her eyes moving quickly across the page. For the first time, neither of them spoke immediately. I watched their expressions shift, not dramatically, but enough. Recognition. Calculation. A flicker of something else. You went to see Mr. Cole, Daniel said finally. Yes, I replied. I did. The room felt different now. Not because of what I had said, but because of what I had brought with me. For the first time since this began, I was not reacting to what they placed in front of me. They were reacting to what I had placed in front of them. But as Daniel straightened and set the paper down slowly, his eyes meeting mine with a new kind of focus, I realized something else just as clearly. If they had already gone as far as replacing locks and filing documents, they were not going to step back quietly. And whatever they did next was not going to be subtle. Daniel did not raise his voice. That was what made it more unsettling. He simply picked up the document I had placed in front of him, read it again more slowly, then set it down with a careful kind of precision. Okay, he said, exhaling through his nose. If that is how you want to handle it, we can do this formally. Melissa did not speak right away. She stepped around the coffee table instead, moving closer to the front door, her eyes flicking briefly toward the keypad before returning to me. We were hoping to keep this simple, she said. But if attorneys are involved, then everything changes. I met her gaze without stepping back. It already changed when you replaced the locks, I replied. There was a brief pause, then Daniel nodded once, as if accepting a new set of rules. Fine, he said. Then let us be clear about something. He reached into his folder again and pulled out a thicker packet this time, one I had not seen before. He placed it on the table and slid it toward me. We have already initiated a formal review of the property under the trust, he said. Pending clarification, the house is being evaluated as part of the estate management process. I did not touch the packet immediately. Evaluated for what? I asked. For potential restructuring, Melissa answered smoothly. Including sale, lease, or transfer into managed housing. It is standard when there is uncertainty. I picked up the packet then and opened it. Inside were multiple documents, a preliminary market analysis, a scheduling notice, and one page that stood out immediately, a letter from a real estate firm confirming an appointment. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I looked up slowly. You scheduled a showing, I said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. An evaluation, he corrected. No decisions have been made. I held the paper between my fingers, letting the words settle. Tomorrow, in my home, without my consent. You are moving very quickly, I said. Because delays create risk, he replied. If there are legal complications, we need documentation in place. This protects everyone. Melissa stepped closer again, her tone softer but more direct. Evelyn, this is not about taking anything from you. It is about making sure nothing falls apart while things get sorted out. I closed the folder gently and set it back on the table. You are preparing for outcomes you have already decided, I said. Neither of them denied it. That, more than anything, clarified the moment. Daniel straightened, his expression composed. We are preparing for possibilities, he said, and we are not going to wait until something goes wrong to act. I studied him for a second longer, then gave a small nod. All right, I said. Then we will proceed properly. Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly, just enough to show she was trying to read what I meant. What does that look like to you? She asked. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving them in the living room for just a moment. I needed the space, not to think, but to move at my own pace. I reached into the drawer by the refrigerator and pulled out a small notepad, the one I use for grocery lists, and wrote down the time from the letter. 2 o'clock. Then I walked back into the room and placed the notepad beside their documents. It looks like this, I said calmly. If anyone is coming into my home tomorrow, I will be present. My attorney will be present, and everything that is discussed will be documented. Daniel's expression tightened again, but only briefly. That is not necessary, he said. It is just a preliminary walkthrough. I held his gaze. Then it will not be a problem. Melissa crossed her arms lightly, her posture shifting from cooperative to measured. You are making this more complicated than it needs to be, she said. No, I am making it visible. The word hung there, quiet but firm. For a moment, no one moved. Then Daniel nodded once, a decision settling behind his eyes. 2 o'clock, he said. We will be here. I inclined my head slightly. So will I. They gathered their papers more slowly this time, neither rushing nor lingering. When they reached the door, Daniel paused, his hand hovering near the keypad. We will set up your code later, he said. I gave a faint smile. I will let you know if I need one. After they left, I stood in the entryway, looking at the keypad again. The house felt different now, not because of what had been done, but because of what was about to happen. Tomorrow was no longer just an evaluation. It was a stage, and as I turned back toward the living room, my eyes settling briefly on the folder I had brought from Mr. Cole's office, one thought settled in with quiet certainty. If they believed tomorrow would move things forward for them, they had not yet realized it might be the moment everything turns against them. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had not slept, but because I no longer needed to lie still and wonder what came next. I already knew. By 8 o'clock, I had the dining table cleared and reset, not for a meal, but for documents. I placed 3 folders side by side. The original will, Robert's handwritten letter, and the certified copies Mr. Cole had prepared, each one aligned carefully, edges straight, nothing overlapping. Then I added something new, a small digital recorder, no larger than a deck of cards, placed discreetly near the center of the table. I pressed the test button once, listened to the faint playback, then turned it off. Just in case, I said quietly to myself. Around 10, I made 2 calls. The first was to Mr. Cole, confirming he would arrive by 1:45. We will keep it professional, he said. Let them speak first. I intendo, he replied. The second call was to the real estate office listed on the appointment letter. A young woman answered, cheerful, efficient. Good morning, this is Westbrook Realty. Hello, I said. I'm calling regarding the 2 o'clock appointment at my address today. There was a brief pause as she pulled up the file. Yes, We have you scheduled for a property evaluation. Then I want to be clear, I said evenly. No documents are to be signed, and no photographs are to be taken without my explicit permission. Another pause, slightly longer this time. Of course, ma'am, she said. We will note that. When I ended the call, I felt something settle firmly into place. Not just awareness. Control. By noon, I dressed with more care than I had in days. A navy blouse, pressed slacks, the pearl earrings Robert had given me on our 25th anniversary. Not for appearance, but for presence. If this was going to be a confrontation, it would be on my terms. At 1:30, Daniel and Melissa arrived. They did not knock. The keypad beeped softly, and the door opened. I was already standing in the hallway when they stepped inside. Daniel gave a small nod. You are ready, he said. I am, I replied. Melissa glanced toward the dining room, her eyes immediately finding the folders on the table. You have been busy, she said. So have you, I answered. There was no hostility in my voice, just acknowledgement. At 1:45, Mr. Cole arrived precisely on time. Daniel's expression shifted slightly when he saw him, but he stepped aside to let him in. I appreciate you coming, I said. Of course, Mr. Cole replied, setting his briefcase down near the table. We are here to observe and clarify. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. This time, I walked to the door myself and opened it. A man in his mid-40s stood on the porch, neatly dressed, carrying a tablet. Good afternoon, he said with a practiced smile. I am Mark Reynolds with Westbrook Realty. Good afternoon, I replied. Please come in. He stepped inside, pausing just long enough to take in the room, the people, the arrangement of documents. His smile softened slightly, becoming more cautious. Looks like we have a full house, he said lightly. We believe in being thorough, I replied. As he began his walkthrough, moving from the living room to the kitchen, commenting on square footage and layout, I stayed close enough to listen, but far enough not to interfere. Daniel and Melissa followed him, occasionally adding details, speaking as if the house were already something to be described rather than lived in. The kitchen was updated about 10 years ago, Daniel said. Hardwood floors throughout, Melissa added. I'll let them speak. I'll let them build the picture they wanted him to see. When Mark returned to the dining room, he paused, looking at the table. Are these part of the review? He asked, gesturing toward the folders. Daniel stepped forward quickly. No, those are just personal documents. Actually, I said calmly, stepping beside the table, they're exactly what this review depends on. I opened the top folder and turned it slightly so Mark could see the header. Legal documentation. Certified copies. Mr. Cole stepped forward just enough to stand within view. We are ensuring that any evaluation is based on accurate ownership records, he said. Mark's posture shifted again, more formal now. Of course, he said. That makes sense. I watched Daniel out of the corner of my eye. His jaw tightened just slightly. Melissa remained still, but her attention sharpened. They had expected a walkthrough, a quiet step forward. Not this. Not witnesses. Not documentation laid out in plain view. And as I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the table, feeling the steady surface beneath my fingers, I realized something with absolute clarity. They had walked into this believing they were setting the terms. But now, every word they said, every assumption they made, was happening in front of someone who could verify it. And as Mark reached for his tablet again, preparing to continue, one thought settled firmly in my mind. The next thing Daniel says will not be for me. It will be for the record. And that is where people tend to make their first real mistake. Mark did not move right away after Mr. Cole spoke. He stood there for a second, tablet in hand, looking between the documents on the table and the three of us, recalibrating the situation. I just want to make sure I am proceeding appropriately, he said carefully. Who is the current legal decision maker for the property? The question landed exactly where it needed to. Daniel answered first. I am listed as managing beneficiary under the trust, he said, his tone steady, practiced. Mr. Cole did not interrupt him. He simply reached forward, opened the top folder, and slid one page toward Mark. And this, he said calmly, is the verified will and governing clause that supersedes any incomplete or improperly filed trust. Mark leaned in slightly, reading the header, his expression shifting from polite neutrality to professional caution. "So, there's a dispute?" he asked. "There's a clarification in progress," I replied before either Daniel or Melissa could answer. My voice remained even, but I did not soften the words. Mark nodded slowly, then tapped his tablet once, likely, updating his notes. "In that case," he said, "I will limit today's visit to general observations. No valuation will be finalized until ownership is confirmed." That was the first real shift. Subtle, but significant. Daniel noticed it immediately. "That is not necessary," he said, stepping forward. "We can proceed with a preliminary range. There is no harm in having an estimate." Mark glanced at Mr. Cole, then back at Daniel. "I understand," he said, "but my company policy is very clear. If there is any uncertainty regarding authority, we pause." Melissa stepped in then, her tone smoother, more persuasive. "We are not asking for anything binding," she said. "Just information. You can provide that without committing to anything." Mark hesitated, just for a moment. That was all it took. Mr. Cole spoke again, his voice measured but firm. "Providing a valuation in the presence of conflicting claims can influence subsequent decisions," he said. "It is not as neutral as it sounds." Mark straightened slightly. "Then I will keep it general," he said. "No written estimate today." I inclined my head once. "That would be appropriate." Daniel exhaled quietly, but he did not argue further. Instead, he shifted tactics. "Fine," he said. "Then let us at least discuss next steps." He turned toward me, his expression composed, but more direct than before. "Mom, if this is going to move forward legally, we need to consolidate everything. Accounts, documents, access. It cannot stay fragmented." I met his gaze without hesitation. "It is not fragmented," I said. "It is protected." Melissa crossed her arms lightly, her voice calm, but sharper now. "Protected from whom?" she asked. I let the question sit for a second, then answered simply. "From anyone who acts without my consent." The room fell quiet again. Mark shifted his weight slightly, clearly aware he had stepped into something more than a standard appointment. "I can step outside if you need to continue this discussion privately," he offered. "That will not be necessary," I said. "You may stay." I wanted him to stay. I wanted every word to carry weight beyond this room. Daniel nodded slowly, then reached into his folder again. This time, he pulled out a document I had not seen before and placed it on the table with deliberate care. "Then let us be transparent," he said. "This is a notice of intent." I looked down at the page. Legal formatting, formal language, and one line that stood out immediately. "Petition for temporary financial oversight pending estate clarification." I felt the shift the moment I read it. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. They had already taken the next step, without waiting, without asking. I looked up at him. "You filed this?" I asked. "It is a precaution," he replied. "If the court grants temporary oversight, it allows me to manage everything until the situation is resolved." Melissa added quietly, "It prevents delays, protects the assets." I held the paper for a moment longer, then set it back down. "And you believe that includes this house?" I said. Daniel did not hesitate. "Yes," he said. That was the second shift. Clear, unambiguous, not implied, stated. I nodded once, slowly, then reached into my own folder and pulled out a document Mr. Cole had prepared that morning but had not yet been shown. I placed it on top of his notice, aligning the edges carefully. "Then you should read this before you proceed any further," I said. Daniel frowned slightly, then picked it up. As his eyes moved across the page, I watched the change happen. Not dramatic, not immediate, but there. Recognition again, followed by something tighter. Melissa leaned in, reading over his shoulder, her composure holding for a second longer before her expression sharpened. Mr. Cole stepped forward just enough to clarify. "This is a formal objection and counter notice," he said. "Filed this morning. It challenges any unauthorized filings and asserts sole authority pending full review." Daniel lowered the paper slowly, his eyes lifting to meet mine. "You moved faster than I expected," he said. I gave a small, composed nod. "You taught me the value of timing," I replied. The room held still for a moment, the balance no longer where it had been even an hour ago. But as Daniel set the document down and straightened his posture, something else settled into place behind his expression. Not retreat, adjustment. And as he reached for his folder again, preparing to respond, I realized the next move would not be about paperwork alone. Because when someone's plan is interrupted this cleanly, they do not stop. They change tactics. And whatever Daniel was about to say next would tell me exactly how far he was willing to go. Daniel did not rush this time. He held the counter notice in, his hand a moment longer than necessary, then set it down carefully beside his own filing, aligning the edges as if that simple act could restore some sense of control. "All right," he said quietly. "Then let us stop circling around this." He reached into his folder again, slower now, more deliberate, and pulled out a sealed envelope I had not seen before. Thicker than the others. Official. He placed it on the table without sliding it forward. "This was delivered to my office this morning," he said. "I was not planning to bring it up yet, but since we were putting everything on the table." Melissa glanced at him, just briefly, then back at me. There was something different in her expression now. Not calculation. Not quite confidence either. Something closer to anticipation. "Go ahead," I said. Daniel opened the envelope and removed a stamped document, unfolding it with careful precision. "This is a notice from the bank," he said, "regarding account activity tied to Dad's estate." He turned it toward me, but kept his hand on the edge, as if he still controlled how much I could see. "There were transfers," he continued, "large ones, before and after his passing." I stepped forward and took the document from his hand. This time, I did not wait for permission. The paper was official, the bank's letterhead clear at the top. Transaction summaries, dates, amounts, and then I saw it, a series of withdrawals, not the small monthly ones I had already noticed. Larger, 10,000, 15,000, spread across several months. My eyes moved down the page, steady, controlled, until they reached the final column. Authorized by. I read the name once. Then again. It was not Daniel's. It was not mine. It was Robert's. But the dates did not match. The signatures did not align with the timeline I knew. "This does not make sense," I said, more to the document than to him. Daniel's voice remained calm. "That is exactly the point," he said. "There are inconsistencies, which is why the bank flagged it." Melissa stepped closer, her tone measured. "They are investigating potential mismanagement," she said. "And until that is resolved, everything tied to those accounts could be subject to review." I looked up slowly, meeting Daniel's eyes. "And you believe this supports your position?" I said. He did not flinch. "I believe it raises serious questions," he replied. "Questions that a court will want answered." For a moment, the room shifted again, not back in their favor, but into something more complex. This was new, a layer I had not seen, a piece that could complicate everything if left unanswered. I lowered the document slightly, then turned toward Mr. Cole. "Have you seen this?" I asked. He stepped forward, taking the paper from my hand, scanning it quickly but thoroughly. His expression did not change at first. Then, as his eyes moved to the authorization lines, something sharpened. "Where did you say this came from?" he asked Daniel. "Directly from the bank," Daniel replied. "They sent it to me as part of the trust review." Mr. Cole nodded once, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a different set of documents. "Then let us verify something," he said. He placed a second statement on the table beside the first. Same bank, same account, same date range. But as my eyes moved across the page, I saw the difference immediately. The withdrawals were there. The amounts matched, but the authorization lines did not. Instead of Robert's name, there was a notation. Automated disbursement. Scheduled transfer. I looked between the two documents, the difference clear, undeniable. "These are not the same records," I said. Mr. Cole's voice remained steady. "No," he said, "they are not." Daniel frowned slightly, leaning forward. "What are you saying?" Mr. Cole turned the second document toward him. "I am saying that this version," he said, tapping the page Daniel had brought, "has been altered." The word settled heavily in the room. Melissa straightened, her composure tightening. "That is a serious claim," she said. "It is a factual observation," Mr. Cole replied. The bank's internal notation system does not match what is shown here. These authorization lines should not exist in this form. Daniel's expression shifted then, not dramatically, but enough. There must be an explanation, he said. I watched him carefully as he spoke. Not just the words, the timing, the hesitation before them. There is, I said quietly. Both of them looked at me. I reached into my folder and pulled out one more document, one I had not shown yet. A certified statement from the bank, requested that morning through Mr. Cole's office. I placed it on the table, directly between the two conflicting pages. This is the official record, I said, requested independently. Verified this morning. Daniel stared at it, his jaw tightening as he read. Melissa leaned in beside him, her silence louder than anything she could have said. Mr. Cole spoke again, his tone calm but final. If a document has been altered to support a legal claim, he said, that changes the nature of this entire situation. The room held still, the balance no longer uncertain. Not implied, not questioned, established. I looked at Daniel, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with something steadier. So, I said, my voice even, would you like to explain how this version ended up in your hands? He did not answer immediately, and as the silence stretched just long enough to matter, I realized this was no longer about what they were planning to do. It was about what they had already done. And the next thing Daniel said would not just defend his position. It would define it. The silence did not last this time. It broke fast, sharp, like something snapping under too much pressure. That is not possible, Daniel said, his voice rising for the first time. He picked up the altered document again, flipping it over as if the answer might be hiding on the back. I got this directly from the bank. I did not change anything. Then explain it, I said, louder than I had intended, my hand pressing flat against the table. I could feel my heartbeat now, not steady anymore, but heavy, pushing up into my chest. Because this version is not just wrong, Daniel. It is fabricated. Melissa stepped in immediately, her voice tighter, less polished than before. You are making accusations without proof, she said. No, I snapped, turning toward her. The proof is right there. I pointed to the two documents side by side. The difference is unmistakable now that they had been named. One of these is real. The other is not. And you brought the one that is not into my house. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the living room before turning back. Why would I do that? He demanded. What would I gain from falsifying anything? Control, I said, the word coming out before I could soften it. You gain control. Over the accounts. Over this house. Over me. The room tightened around that sentence. Mark shifted near the doorway, clearly uncomfortable now, his tablet lowered at his side. Mr. Cole remained still, watching, letting the moment unfold. Melissa's expression hardened. That is unfair, she said. We have been trying to help you. I let out a short, incredulous breath. Help me, I repeated. You changed the locks without telling me. You redirected my mail. You went through my files while I was out of the house. And now this. My voice rose again, not screaming, but sharp enough to cut through the room. Do not stand there and tell me this is help. Daniel stepped closer, his tone shifting from defensive to something more forceful. You are overreacting, he said. There are discrepancies, yes, but that does not mean anyone here did anything wrong. The bank could have made an error. Documents get misprocessed all the time. Then why does your version benefit you? I shot back. Why does it give you authority you do not have? He stopped, just for a second, but it was enough. Melissa turned toward him, her voice lower now, urgent. Daniel, she said quietly, just tell her what the bank said. He hesitated again, then exhaled slowly. They said the records were incomplete, he admitted. They said they were still reviewing. That is not what you told me, I said. You told me this supported your position. Because it does, he insisted, but the certainty was thinner now. I shook my head, my hands no longer steady as I reached for the certified statement and held it up slightly. This supports the truth, I said. And the truth does not match what you brought into this house. The weight of that settled heavily. Not just suspicion anymore. Not just questions. Something concrete. Something that could not be brushed aside. Mr. Cole stepped forward then, his voice firm, no longer just observing. At this point, he said, we are dealing with conflicting documentation that suggests potential misrepresentation. That has legal consequences. Mark cleared his throat softly. I think I should step out, he said. This is beyond a property evaluation. No, I said quickly, turning toward him. You should stay. He paused, uncertain, then nodded slowly. The room needed a witness. I needed a witness. Daniel looked at me again, and for the first time I saw something break through the control he had been holding on to. Not anger, not confidence, something closer to realization. You really think I would do this to you? He said quietly. I felt my throat tighten, but I did not look away. I think, I said, my voice lower now, but no less firm, that you have already done things you cannot explain. And this is one more of them. Melissa's composure cracked then, just slightly. This is getting out of hand, she said. We need to stop this before it turns into something bigger. I let out a slow breath, my hand still trembling slightly as I set the document back on the table. It already is something bigger, I said. You just did not expect me to see it. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was not uncertain. It was heavy with consequence. Daniel looked down at the documents, then back at me, his expression shifting into something more calculated again, but not as controlled as before. Then we will let the court decide, he said finally. I nodded once. Yes, I replied. We will. But as I stood there, feeling the weight of everything that had just come into the open, one thing became painfully clear. This was no longer just about proving who was right. It was about uncovering how far this had already gone. And if this document was only the first thing that could not be explained, then what else was waiting to be exposed next? The knock came 2 days later, sharp and official, cutting clean through the quiet of the house. I was in the kitchen when I heard it, standing at the counter where Robert used to sort the mail, the same counter where everything had begun to unravel. For a brief second, I closed my eyes, steadying myself, then walked to the door and opened it. 2 officers stood on the porch, one older, one younger, both composed in the way that told me this was not a mistake. Mrs. Carter? The older one asked. Yes, I replied. We are here regarding a report filed through Harris & Cole Law Office, he said. We need to speak with Daniel Carter. I stepped aside without hesitation. He's inside. Daniel had arrived earlier that morning, unannounced again, pacing in the living room with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent. Melissa sat on the edge of the couch, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the floor. They both looked up the moment the officers entered. What is this? Daniel asked, his tone sharp, defensive. The older officer stepped forward, calm but direct. Mr. Carter, we need to ask you a few questions regarding documentation submitted in connection with your father's estate. Daniel's expression shifted instantly. I have done nothing wrong, he said. Then this will be straightforward, the officer replied. Melissa stood up quickly. There has to be some kind of misunderstanding, she said. We have been trying to manage everything responsibly. I did not move. I stood near the doorway, my hands resting lightly at my sides, watching as the room rearranged itself around the truth. Mr. Cole had not wasted time. The altered bank document, the unauthorized trust filing, the locksmith invoice. Every piece had been submitted, verified, documented. Not as accusations, as evidence. We are not here to debate intentions, the officer said. We are here to address the records. He turned slightly toward Daniel. Sir, we're going to need you to come with us so we can clarify a few things. Daniel let out a short, incredulous laugh. You're kidding, right? He said. This is a paperwork issue. It is more than that, the officer replied evenly. And it is better handled at the station. Melissa stepped closer to him, her voice dropping. Daniel, just go with them. We will sort it out. But her tone had changed. The confidence was gone. What remained was calculation, thinner now, less certain. Daniel looked at her, then back at me. For a moment, something passed across his face. Not anger, not even defiance. Something closer to realization. You did this, he said quietly. I met his gaze, my voice steady, but no longer soft. No, I said. You did. The words landed heavier than anything I'd said before. The younger officer stepped forward slightly. Sir, Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair before nodding once. "Fine," he said. "I will come." As I guided him toward the door, he did not resist. He did not argue again, but he did not look back either. Melissa stood frozen for a second longer, then turned toward me. "This is not over," she said, her voice tight, controlled, but no longer assured. I took a step closer, not to confront her, but to close the distance that had existed for years without me noticing. "It is for you," I said. She held my gaze for a moment, searching for something, then looked away. Within an hour, she was gone too. Not escorted, not formally removed, but gone all the same. Her car pulled out of the driveway without a word, without a glance back. The house fell quiet again after that. But this time it was not empty. It was mine, completely. I walked through each room slowly, not out of habit, but with intention. The living room where Robert had read every evening. The kitchen where we had planned our lives in small, ordinary conversations. The front door with its new lock, its keypad, still blinking softly. I reached out and pressed a few buttons, resetting the code. Not because I needed to, but because I could. Later that afternoon, a locksmith arrived. This time, I had made the call. I watched as he removed the lock Daniel had installed and replaced it with one I chose. New keys. New control. "You want extra copies?" he asked. I shook my head. "No," I said. "One is enough." That evening, I sat at the dining table, the same table where everything had started to come apart, and placed Robert's letter in front of me again. Trust must always be confirmed, not assumed. I let out a slow breath, the tension of the past days finally settling into something quieter, something resolved. Daniel had made his choices. Melissa had made hers. And now they were living with the consequences of both. I was not the woman they had tried to manage. I was not the one who had been left out of the decisions. I was the one who stayed. And as the sun dipped lower outside the window, casting long shadows across the room, one truth stood clearer than anything else. They had tried to take everything from me, and in the end, they lost far more than they ever expected.